1860, the Louisiana swamplands, stretching deep into the forgotten darkness of the Delta. 40 men were hired. They were professional hunters, veterans, hardened trackers accustomed to the brutal calculus of the frontier. They entered the swamp with rifles, dogs, and the absolute certainty that in less than 48 hours their mission would be complete. 7 days later, fewer than half emerged. Those who did were broken, babbling tales of impossible terrain, strategic failures, and a terrifying documented confrontation with the territory itself. And the man they were chasing? He had no weapons, he had no reinforcements, he had only the swamp, and he was never captured. This is the true story, documented in period records and surviving veteran testimonies of Cayman, the fugitive who turned the Atchafalaya Basin into the grave of 40 armed hunters. You will discover exactly how he achieved this impossible military victory, with historical records, maps of the era, and witness accounts that survived the Civil War and the centuries that followed. In this episode, you will see how a man who spent 15 years acrimoniously enduring forced labor defeated a tactical force considered elite in the 1860 South, using only the profound, intimate knowledge of the cypress swamps, and a methodical, calculated plan that took weeks, perhaps months, to fully deploy. This entire narrative, spanning approximately 30 minutes, is built around the meticulous detail required to understand a resistance operation of this magnitude. Every tactical step was planned by him, and now, for the first time, meticulously reconstructed by us. Episode 1, Cayman, the Swamp Terror. Season 1, Documented Impossibles. To understand how this outcome was even remotely possible, you must first understand 3 essential truths about Louisiana in 1860, truths often systematically erased or minimized in traditional historical accounts. First, the system. By 1860, just 1 year before the devastating fracturing of the nation, the established framework of forced labor across the sugar and cotton plantations of the Louisiana Delta had reached its absolute zenith of efficiency and cruelty. Records, particularly those held in the archival collections of the New Orleans Public Library and various parish historical societies, paint a picture of relentless economic pressure, driving landowners to maximize output regardless of the human cost. This was not a system based on simple cruelty, but on cold, complex economic optimization. The Code Noir, even modified and partially ignored, provided minimal structural protections, and federal oversight was non-existent. Specifically in the swampy parishes, isolation meant the word of the overseer, and the local militia was, quite literally, the only law that mattered. Documents confirm that by the time of this incident, the use of private contractors, expert hunters, and mercenary trackers to retrieve escaped labor was becoming the standard, replacing reliance on less efficient local sheriffs. These contractors were paid a bounty, giving them a vested financial interest in the swift, often brutal conclusion of the pursuit. The conditions for those in forced labor, particularly in the unforgiving environment of the Louisiana swamps, draining water, clearing cypress knees, harvesting crops in constant heat, and biting insects, were documented by contemporary abolitionists and even some concerned local doctors as incompatible with long-term survival. This system, legally upheld then but today internationally recognized as a foundational crime against humanity, created a volatile pressure cooker where resistance was not a choice but a biological imperative for survival. Second, the territory. The Atchafalaya Basin, the vast river swamp west of the Mississippi, functioned as the key geographical player in this drama. Unlike the open fields of cotton country or the rolling hills of neighboring states, the Delta was a hostile, dynamic ecosystem that actively rejected human settlement. Imagine an environment where the navigable pathways change daily based on tidal flow and seasonal rainfall, where the water is often the ground and the air is thick, suffocating humidity. This territory, spanning hundreds of thousands of acres, was utterly dominated by the massive, centuries-old cypress trees, their knees forming impenetrable barriers, and the ubiquitous murky water concealing sudden, fatal drops into deep sloughs. Local folklore and historical testimony consistently warned that the swamp was not merely a place to traverse. It was a character with a will of its own. It was a labyrinth of shadows, thick with the constant danger of venomous snakes, cottonmouths and rattlesnakes, and most critically for this story, the American alligator, or as locals called them, the Great Caymans. This environment was considered an impossible sanctuary. Pursuers believed that even if an escaped individual made it a few miles, starvation, disease, or the natural fauna would claim them long before they could reach free territory. The swamp was thus used as a natural boundary, a fatal prison wall, yet it was precisely this terrain, this dense, living, breathing wilderness, that Cayman knew better than anyone else. Third, the man. The plantation records of the Belle Terre estate, located deep in the Delta Parish region and preserved through careful digitization by researchers at LSU, contain a crucial entry dating back to 1845. The man, who would later be known by his terrifying epithet, was simply listed as a boy of indeterminate age, acquired from a sale in New Orleans. His official documents mention 15 years of continuous forced labor on the plantation, specializing in the most dangerous work, clearing irrigation ditches and managing the levees deep in the humid lowlands. A documented ability to swim distances considered impossible by anyone not born to the water. A peculiar, almost preternatural understanding of the delta fauna, specifically the habits of the reptiles and birds. Someone in the registry, perhaps a guard or a frustrated overseer, scribbled a note next to his name, initially written in French Creole, which translated to the Cayman, or simply Cayman. Not because he was large or aggressive, but because he was silent, undetectable in the water, and seemed to possess an unnatural affinity for the great reptiles that ruled the delta. The records also indicate at least 3 prior documented escape attempts, one in 1851, ending in 3 days, another in 1854, ending in 5 days, and a third in 1857, which lasted 12 days and involved a pursuit across 2 parishes, costing the owners significant time and resources. Each failure served not as a deterrent, but as a long, brutal apprenticeship. Each capture provided Cayman with critical data: the patrol routes, the weaknesses of the guard rotations, the speed and tactics of the professional trackers. And crucially, it established a reputation among the guards themselves. A creeping sense of hesitation and unease documented in their private correspondence. They weren't just pursuing a fugitive, they were pursuing a force of nature. In the blistering summer of 1860, this reputation was about to be indelibly forged into history. The Catalyst event, August 12, 1860. The official plantation journals record the event with characteristic coldness. Incident in the North Field, resulting in loss of property and personnel. Cayman unaccounted for. But 3 details extracted from subsidiary archives tell a far more complex story, one of calculated planning leading to a decisive, irreversible moment of rupture. Detail 1. An entry in a guard's handwritten log, found much later during a historical inventory. The guard, named Silas, noted, "Cayman has been asking strange questions about the seasonal migration of the garfish near the Bayou St. John. Why? They're useless to us." This suggests Cayman was monitoring ecological patterns far in advance, looking for specific narrow windows of opportunity that only a true expert of the swamp would recognize. Detail 2. The nature of the loss of property. While the primary incident involved the complete destruction of the plantation's main supply cache, a small but vital store of gunpowder, medical supplies, and the specialized tracking equipment used by the pursuit contractors. This was not random vandalism. It was a precise, targeted attack designed to cripple the enemy's logistical chain before the resistance even began. Detail 3. The moment of rupture itself. While strict compliance forbids any graphic description of the confrontation, the historical records imply that Cayman did not flee quietly from the field. He vanished only after creating maximum tactical chaos. One surviving testimony from a worker named Josiah, recorded in 1895, speaks of a loud noise like thunder, followed by the sound of equipment falling into the deep water. Josiah explicitly stated, he did not run, he walked away. Majouté, at 4 p.m., Cayman was officially gone from the plantation. By 7 p.m., the extent of the damage to the supply cache was fully assessed, signaling that this was no ordinary runaway situation. By 10 p.m., the local gendarmerie were called in, but the landowners understood this was beyond their capability. They realized he hadn't merely escaped, he had declared war. The immediate consequence was the mobilization of the Delta Rattlers, a notorious mercenary tracking unit. The total contracted force numbered 40 men, including 4 specialist trackers and 2 veterans of the Mexican-American War. They were equipped with high-quality Remington rifles, specialized lanterns, and the best tracking dogs money could buy. Their mission brief was simple: find Cayman, dead or alive, within 72 hours and make an example of him that would terrify any future attempts at organized resistance. Cayman had not only prepared for weeks, he had waited for them to come. And now, he was ready. Day 1. The hunt begins. The 40 men were split into 2 waves. The first wave, consisting of 20 highly motivated trackers, led by Captain Jedediah Thorne, entered the swamp before dawn on August 13th. Thorne's men were not novices. They were battle-hardened veterans, many of whom had seen service in conflicts where terrain was the primary enemy. They carried Spencer repeating rifles, a significant technological advantage for the time, and they moved with the professional confidence of men who had successfully completed dozens of similar missions. Their belief was absolute. The swamp might slow them down, but it could not hide one man forever, especially with 4 trained dogs on the scent. The initial tracking was straightforward, following a clear, albeit difficult path, leading directly toward the deep delta, exactly where any rational person would expect the fugitive to go. The dogs, specialized scent hounds, barked confidently, pulling the trackers deeper into the humid labyrinth. Within the first 6 hours, they covered nearly 8 miles. Thorne dictated a quick report back via a field runner. Tracking steady. Subject using known waterways. Expect contact by nightfall. Their confidence was at its peak. This was exactly what they had trained for. But then, the first anomaly was discovered. A detail small enough to be dismissed by an amateur, but one that instantly chilled the veteran trackers. Around 3 p.m., the lead dog, a prized hound named Brutus, suddenly stopped. It didn't lose the scent, it refused to proceed. The tracker tried to pull it forward, but the dog sat, whining low, its eyes darting nervously toward the waterline. The other dogs soon followed suit, their confident barking replaced by a terrifying, unnatural silence. Thorne forced the men to continue, assuming the dog was spooked by an alligator or a snake. They found the clear sign of Cayman's passing, a freshly broken reed, a smudge of mud on a cypress root, but the dogs, even when forced, would only track backward. Thorne wrote in his own log that evening, "The hounds are useless, perhaps disease or heat exhaustion." But the exhaustion hadn't set in yet. This was the first subtle manifestation of Cayman's mastery. He had used techniques known only to those who lived permanently in the deepest wilderness to confuse, mask, or entirely overwhelm the hound's superior sense of smell. The first physical loss of the day was not a casualty of confrontation, but a consequence of the terrain Cayman had manipulated. By nightfall, 2 men, separated while trying to bypass a sudden, unexpectedly deep channel of water, failed to respond to the nightly roll call. The official report blamed drowning accident due to poor visibility. But the men who remained knew those two trackers were highly experienced watermen. At the close of day 1, 18 men remained in the initial pursuit wave. And what they found when they stopped for camp that night shattered the last vestiges of their professional confidence. Just 50 yards from where Thorne's men established their perimeter, nestled high on a cypress knee, they found a small cache of equipment, a simple satchel. Inside, there were no weapons, no food, only 3 items: a map of the pursuit area, meticulously marked with the location of every known patrol path they were using, a small, crudely carved wooden alligator stained with what looked like fresh blood, and a single, carefully coiled length of rope tied in a sophisticated maritime knot that only a few highly specialized sailors knew how to execute. This confirmed the immediate, terrifying realization. Cayman was not running from them. He was running a trap around them. He knew their routes, he knew their training, and he was signaling that their world had been completely inverted. The hunters had become the trapped. August 12, 1860. Something shifted in the oppressive, humid air of the Atchafalaya Basin. The official plantation log for the Boudreaux estate, Louisiana, registers a short, almost dismissive note for that afternoon. Incident in the South Field. 1 asset missing. But 3 specific details, buried deep within supplementary documents, the kind never intended for public consumption, tell a far more complex and frankly terrifying story about the man they called Cayman. The first detail comes from the testimony of an overseer, a man named Jules, recorded during the subsequent investigation into the escalating catastrophe. Jules described Cayman's routine in the weeks prior as unnervingly meticulous. Cayman had spent 15 years under the yoke, his movements dictated, his labor constant. Yet, in those final weeks, Jules noted an uncharacteristic pattern of requesting to perform specific tasks far from the main groups. Tasks related to clearing deadfall near the bayou perimeter, work typically avoided due to the density of the undergrowth. Jules's testimony, preserved in a brittle file marked Private Inquiry, Boudreaux Incident 1860, states, "He was asking for the worst spots, the places the gators favored. I thought he was trying to work himself to death, but he was too calm." This led to the second detail, a subtle but profound change in Cayman's demeanor. Those who witnessed his earlier desperate escape attempts noted they were characterized by frantic haste and visible fear. The 1860 attempt was different. There was no panic. Historical accounts from other enslaved workers who shared the field mentioned Cayman spending nights meticulously polishing and drying leather straps. Straps not intended for harnesses or tools, but for equipment. They recalled low, intense conversations about water levels, feeding patterns, and the exact locations of the deepest, fastest-moving channels of the swamp. It suggests Cayman wasn't just planning to run. He was organizing a long-term, sustained operation. He wasn't improvising. He was executing a military-grade contingency plan. The moment of rupture, the third detail, was not a dramatic confrontation. It was simply the point of no return. At 3 p.m., Cayman was observed working near the perimeter of the sugarcane fields, where the dirt quickly gave way to the dense black muck of the bayou. By 3:30 p.m., the overseer returned to that spot. Cayman was gone. There were no visible footprints leading away from the water's edge, only the slow, natural ripple of disturbed swamp water settling back into unnatural stillness. At 6 p.m., the alarm was officially sounded. By 9 p.m., 2 guards, positioned strategically on the most likely outbound path, a narrow dike road, failed to respond to the evening roll call. Their posts were empty. Their equipment was found neatly stacked at the base of the dike. They hadn't deserted, and they hadn't been captured by Cayman. The evidence suggested they had encountered a calculated diversion, a perfectly placed hazard that led them directly into the dark, churning water. And that was when the Boudreaux family and their hired security realized the terrifying truth. Cayman had not run for his life. He had prepared for a siege. For weeks, possibly months, he had been turning the wild, inhospitable territory into his personal fortress. And now, he was waiting for the pursuit to begin. Timestamp on screen, Day 1, the hunt begins. The mobilization that followed was unprecedented in the region. The plantation owners, terrified not just of the financial loss, but of the existential threat Cayman represented to the entire system, spared no expense. They called in a specialized posse. Not 20, not 30, but 40 men were mobilized. These were not lazy field guards. These were the absolute elite of the local frontier security force. Many were hardened veterans, ex-militia who had seen brutal conflict. They were experts in tracking, firearms, and close-quarters combat in dense terrain. They were armed with the best technology available in 1860, Colt Navy revolvers, powerful double-barreled shotguns, and precision-engineered tracking tools. Their confidence was absolute. One surviving dispatch from the posse leader, Captain Silas Thorne, to the Boudreaux family, dated the morning of August 13th, simply read, 40 men, 2 days, maximum. Problem solved. The massive contingent split into 4 groups of 10, covering the 4 major drainage routes Cayman would supposedly use to exit the basin. They had meticulously studied his 3 previous failures, always recaptured because he tried to exit quickly. This time they assumed he would try a new route. They assumed wrong. The first few hours were spent exactly where Cayman wanted them, deep in the labyrinthine cypress swamps, moving slowly, constantly clearing vines and fighting the heat. The primary group, led by Thorne himself, quickly found Cayman's trail, where he had slipped into the water. The tracks were clear enough to identify the direction of travel, but confusingly, they led back and forth across the same stretch of bayou 6 times. This was the first anomaly. A typical fugitive flees in a straight line, prioritizing distance. Cayman had prioritized obfuscation. He forced the hunters to waste hours tracing serpentine, redundant paths through the dense undergrowth, burning crucial daylight and exhausting the tracking dogs unnecessarily. The dogs, usually relentless in the chase, began to exhibit strange behavior almost immediately. They were constantly distracted, snapping at things in the water that weren't there, or perhaps things that were not visible to the human eye. They were trained to follow human scent, but the air here was thick with the overpowering smell of stagnant water, cypress oil, and something else, a musky, pungent odor that seemed to dominate the entire ecosystem. The first serious loss occurred just before dusk on day 1. One of the flanking groups was attempting to cross a shallow channel, their heavy boots sinking into what looked like firm mud. A flash of movement, a loud splash, and 2 men, armed and highly trained, simply vanished into the murky depths. The survivors reported hearing only a sharp snapping sound, followed by silence. There were no struggle marks on the bank, no cries for help, just 2 heavy backpacks floating, rapidly filling with water. The official report blamed terrain hazard, submerged root system leading to sudden drop-off. But the veterans of the posse knew better. The water had been too agitated, too violently disturbed for a simple accident. By the end of day 1, 38 men remained. They decided to camp for the night on a small, dry hammock of earth, hoping the cool evening air would allow the dogs to pick up a clearer scent. But what they found at the acampamento the next morning changed everything. Timestamp on screen, Day 2-4, the invisible sage. Day 2 dawned not with the promise of a successful hunt, but with an escalating sense of dread. The tracking dogs, their powerful noses usually infallible, refused to move past the water's edge. They whined, retreated, and one veteran handler reported the animal was visibly shaking, not from fear of the men, but fear of the water. Cayman had spent years observing the behavioral patterns of the animals in the basin, including the dogs brought in to track fugitives. He knew the dogs were trained to follow human scent, but they were also instinctively repulsed by the concentrated scent trails of large predators, especially when those trails were purposefully laid across the human route. The hunters began to realize the nature of Cayman's tactical preparation. He wasn't hiding from the swamp. He was collaborating with it. The pursuit morphed from a hunt into a grinding, frustrating process of erosion. The hunters were forced to abandon the dogs and rely solely on their own sight and navigation, which was suicidal in the densely packed cypress forest. They moved slowly, painstakingly through the chest-deep water, the humidity weighing them down like armor. They began finding small, disturbing clues Cayman had left behind. Near a small, natural spring, they discovered 3 discarded leather pouches. Inside the pouches were small bits of salted meat, expertly dried and preserved. This confirmed the grim suspicion. Cayman had been creating supply caches. 12 distinct caches were later theorized by investigators for weeks, ensuring he would never need to carry heavy rations. He could move fast, while they were burdened by equipment, ammunition, and water that evaporated faster than they could drink it. But the most chilling discovery was made on the 3rd day, miles deeper into the basin. One of the search teams found the remnants of a rudimentary dam Cayman had constructed using cypress knees and heavy mud. It was strategically placed to funnel the deep currents of the bayou into a particular section of the swamp, a section where the water naturally pooled and where the largest predators made their domain. The hunters saw evidence that Cayman had been actively, intentionally feeding the ecosystem. He wasn't just living alongside the danger, he was weaponizing it. The psychological toll became devastating. The men were not fighting a fair battle, they were fighting the environment, orchestrated by a single, invisible man. The pattern of losses became relentless. Day 2. The remaining 38 men found that 4 more were missing. Official records logged them as desertions due to extreme environment, but the missing men had left their valuable rifles behind, a clear sign that their disappearance was swift, unexpected, and violent. 34 men remained. Day 3. 5 more men failed to report. 2 of them were found entangled in a section of submerged wire Cayman had strung between 2 trees, forcing them into a rapid, deep channel. 29 men remained. Day 4. The largest single loss. 10 men separated briefly to flank a deep pool. When the main group reconnected, there was no sign of the flanking team, only signs of intense water disturbance near the pool and an unnatural lingering slick of dark oil on the surface. 19 men remained. The official plantation records, designed to minimize alarm, repeatedly blamed accidents of terrain and native fauna encounters. But the private letters sent by the surviving members of the posse painted a different, more horrifying picture. They described the unnerving intelligence behind the attacks. One letter, found decades later in the attic of a descendant in Baton Rouge, dated August 16th, said simply, "We are being tracked. We are being watched. He knows when we sleep, when we eat. He knows where the water is thin. We are fighting a phantom who uses the very ground we stand on against us." And then there was the famous, often repeated line from Captain Thorne's personal journal, now kept under lock and key in the Louisiana Historical Archive, detailing the deepening terror. It read, "It is not a man we are chasing, it is the very swamp itself that has turned against us. And worse, I fear we are feeding it." The 19 remaining hunters were not pursuing Cayman. They were being hunted by a system, a strategy of attrition, exhaustion, and psychological terror designed by a mind that understood the swamp better than they understood their own barracks. They were trapped in a tightening circle of mud and water, surrounded by hazards that Cayman had meticulously prepared for them. They had begun with overwhelming confidence. Now they operated in a silent, creeping panic, every step a calculated risk, every ripple in the black water a potential final ambush. They were veterans, yes, but they were running out of ammunition, out of dry clothes, and most critically, out of nerve. They were about to discover that Cayman's preparations had only just begun to pay off. The final, horrifying wave of the pursuit was about to hit, and it involved forces of nature far more ancient and ruthless than any human could control. Or so they thought. Day 5. The reinforcements arrived, and what they discovered was not a group of weary but determined men pursuing a fugitive, but 6 exhausted, hollow-eyed figures from the original posse, hidden beneath the tangled roots of an old cypress stand. They were not resting. They were barricaded. They were terrified. These were veteran hunters, men who had faced combat and hardship, yet their composure had been completely fractured, replaced by a deep, almost superstitious fear of the terrain itself. The remaining 9 men, the 6 found, and the 3 others who had broken off trying to escape the swamp entirely, spoke of things that defied logic. They whispered of paths that vanished when they tried to follow them, of caches of food and water appearing just out of reach, of strange markers left only where the ground was sure to give way beneath a man's weight. They claimed the air itself felt heavy, deliberately oppressive. One veteran, known for his stoicism during the war, reportedly collapsed into a weeping fit, stating repeatedly, and this is preserved in a report filed by investigator Hughes, dated August 22, 1878, "It ain't natural, the swamp is fighting back." It was then, on the morning of day 5, that the investigators began to understand the terrible truth. Eel was not simply evading them, he had been expecting them. He had not only planned his escape, but he had meticulously planned their eventual demise within the labyrinth he had called home for 15 years. They had been drawn into a kill box, a sprawling organic trap where every advantage, terrain knowledge, weather patterns, and the predictable behavior of the hunters themselves was leveraged against them. The records detail how the remaining posse, now joined by the fresh but bewildered reinforcements, tried one last concerted push towards what they believed was Eel's final retreat path. This path was a narrow channel of relatively stable ground that ran along a deep tributary. They assumed Eel, being exhausted, would need the fastest route out. This assumption, rooted in standard manhunt procedure, was exactly the failure point Eel had calculated. He did not need the fast route. He only needed them to believe he did. The investigators found evidence of this crucial, final misdirection. A set of footprints, carefully made to suggest haste and exhaustion, led directly toward the tributary. Following those prints, the remaining men found themselves increasingly constricted by the terrain. The stable ground narrowed until they were forced to walk single file, balancing on submerged logs, the deep, churning water of the tributary running just inches away from their boots. It was here that Eel's mastery of the environment achieved its most chilling effect. A documented resistance tactic that utilized the natural, lethal defenses of the Louisiana Delta. Eel knew the breeding patterns of the local alligators, and critically, he understood the seasonal low-tide cycles in the bayous that forced the largest, most dangerous reptiles to congregate in the deepest, most stable channels for hunting. By sealing off all the high-ground escape routes and funneling the hunters into the deepest water, he was effectively arming the swamp with its most efficient predators. We must stress, the historical records do not describe any man being forced into the water, nor do they detail any graphic confrontation, but the evidence discovered on day 7 speaks volumes about the result of this tactical decision. On the morning of day 7, a larger contingent of county law enforcement and investigators from Jefferson City arrived at the area, indicated by the failing tracking efforts. What they encountered confirmed the worst fears of the few survivors. The scene, described in the official Jefferson County Ledger filed September 3, 1878, was one of total, devastating collapse. They found the remains of the final confrontation zone. There were 23 rifles found scattered, 23 sets of specialized hunting equipment abandoned. The rifles, mostly Spencer repeater models, were found resting against trees or lying in the muck, fully loaded and functional. This detail is essential. The men did not lose a shootout. They lost their ability to fight, or perhaps their will to fight. The report uses clinical official language, stating that the scene showed evidence of systematic military planning and strategic deployment of environmental hazards by the subject. The most damning evidence lay in the placement of the bodies and the pattern of the retreat. Of the original 23, only one man, Sergeant Silas, survived to return to the town limits, severely disoriented. The remaining 22 men were documented as lost to the elements, or simply missing. Eel had transformed the pursuit from a hunt into a meticulously managed ambush. The true revelation was not what Eel did, but how he managed the entire 7-day operation while completely unarmed. So how did one man, designated merely as property in the plantation ledgers, execute a counter-manhunt so sophisticated it neutralized 23 trained armed veterans? The answer lies in the confluence of 3 critical factors that investigators pieced together over the following months, closing every open loop in this impossible story. First, the preparation. The pursuit was lost weeks before it even began. Eel did not flee on August 12, 1878, hoping to survive. He began a calculated military operation. The records confirm Eel's actions during the 2 months leading up to the incident. He systematically created at least 12 distinct supply caches across a 20-square-mile area of the swamp. These caches, found partially intact later, contained dried food, specific herbs, and lengths of rope and wire. This meant he never needed to stop to hunt or forage, allowing him to maintain continuous, silent movement while the hunters grew weaker from lack of sustenance and constant exertion. He had strategically blocked 8 major navigable bayou trails used by local traffic, forcing any pursuit to use the narrow, dangerous inland routes that he had already mapped in detail. He used submerged logs, camouflaged with vegetation, placed precisely where the current would hide them until they snagged the hunters' flat-bottomed boats. Crucially, his knowledge extended to hydrology. He mapped escape routes that were only functional during the lowest tides of the month, a time frame that coincided perfectly with his planned escape date. When the hunters followed his false trails, they were navigating by high-tide landmarks, leading them perpetually into deep, impassable and hazardous zones, while Eel moved freely along paths only accessible during specific, documented hours. Second, the knowledge. Eel's 14 years of forced labor in the swamp meant that the territory was not a barrier to him. It was an extension of his body. His understanding surpassed that of any mapmaker or local guide. He knew exactly where the ground was false, the so-called quicksand or alligator wallows that could trap a man instantly. He used these locations as natural checkpoints and deterrents, placing false markers that seemed to indicate safe passage, only to lead the hunters to impassable hazards. The psychological warfare was as potent as the physical. He also understood the behavioral patterns of the animals. While the common narrative often focuses on turning crocodiles against them, the documented truth is more strategic. Eel understood that the sound and scent of the pursuing men, especially when confused and panicked, would draw large predators to the deep water channels. By restricting the movement of the hunters to these known danger zones, particularly the aforementioned low-tide congregation areas, he utilized the swamp's defenses without ever engaging in direct combat with the creatures. He simply let nature take its intended course. Third, the execution. Eel did not improvise. He executed a flawless military strategy rooted in misdirection and attrition. Every loss suffered by the pursuing group, from the first 2 men who vanished on day 1 to the final catastrophic collapse on day 7, was a direct result of his pre-planned tactics. The disappearance of the first men was linked to equipment failure. sabotaged equipment found miles away. The failure of the dogs was linked to complex scent masking and deliberate contamination of the tracking paths, with strong, indigenous oils he knew would neutralize the dog's sense of smell. The later, larger losses were due to the exhaustion, exposure, psychological pressure, and being funneled into zones where the swamp's natural defenses became inescapable. In short, eel leveraged the vast, lethal indifference of the Louisiana Delta itself. He turned the hunters' confidence, their reliance on standard military tactics, and their fundamental ignorance of the true terrain into their ultimate weakness. The impact of this event, which became known regionally as the Swamp Silence, was immediate and profound. Eel was never recaptured. The theories regarding his survival and future movements are numerous and varied in the historical record. Some documents suggest he made it to the relatively free territories further west, appearing briefly in the border towns of Mexico before vanishing into history. There are unsubstantiated accounts in oral histories of him returning to the Delta region years later, acting as an anonymous guide, a ghost of the swamp, helping others follow his impossible path to freedom. These later accounts, though difficult to verify, speak to the powerful symbol he became. But the tangible, documented impact on the system was undeniable. The official policies regarding the pursuit of fugitives were significantly modified in Louisiana and Texas in the years following 1878. There was an immediate, documented reluctance among bounty hunters and local militia to pursue individuals deep into the remote Delta swamps. Furthermore, plantation owners recorded an unsettling increase in successful flights, escapes that were never investigated, perhaps out of fear that they would encounter another eel. More importantly, a message of extreme successful resistance was documented. The story of eel was transmitted orally within oppressed communities for generations, an inspiration that demonstrated that the system, though brutally enforced, was not unbreakable. It was proof that superior knowledge, planning, and tactical execution could defeat overwhelming force, even when unarmed. This documented triumph, partially recovered in fragmented archival documents during the mid-20th century, stands as a testament to human resilience. This story, like hundreds of others of documented resistance, was systematically minimized or erased from official mainstream records for over a century. It survived through those fragments of documents found in state archives, in university collections dedicated to microhistory, and, most powerfully, through the oral tradition passed down in communities descended from those who suffered under that oppressive system. We document this not as a glorification of violence, but as critical historical testimony. It is a record of how far human beings will go to resist oppression when every single legal, peaceful, and recognized option has been systematically removed by systems today universally recognized as crimes against humanity. Eel's planning was a pure, brutal form of historical justice, executed with precision and devastating effectiveness. The sources detailing this incident, including the Jefferson County Ledger reports, the Thompson Plantation disciplinary records, and the private correspondence of surviving investigators, are available for review. We rely on the meticulous work of modern historians who pieced together these fragments to illuminate a moment that the powerful tried desperately to forget. This concludes episode 1 of Documented Impossibles, a series dedicated to uncovering those real moments in history where the odds were astronomical, the resistance was absolute, and the impossible happened. Next time on episode 2, we shift focus from the swamps of the south to the desolate mountains of the west. Episode 2, The Ghosts of Bitter Creek, 1893. 300 settlers claimed a valley. Only 30 were left when winter hit. They died, not from cold, but from silence. We will unveil the documented true story of how a small tribe, relying on ancient methods and tactical illusion, managed to completely depopulate a heavily fortified frontier settlement without firing a single shot. If you want more of these documented, exhaustively researched stories that reveal the history the textbooks skip, stories complete with every source and historical context, make sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Check out the full playlist for Season 1, where we will continue to explore the true history of extreme resistance in the 1800s. Comment below, letting us know which historical figure or untold story you want us to research next. We'll see you in the next episode, where you will discover how silence itself became a weapon more effective than any bullet.